Taking good photos is a lot about using your eyes for spotting good subjects, but a lot of the time, once you have a good subject, your photos don't turn out because you don't know how to make the most of the settings of your camera. This tutorial is designed to help you understand the most important settings in using an SLR camera. There are really several different elements you need to understand when using a camera, and taking good quality photos is about learning what each does and juggling them for the best results. The first one we will discuss is ISO. ISO stands for International Standard Organization. It really just means the speed of the film. The faster the ISO, the more light it can capture in a shorter amount of time. A slower ISO captures light more slowly. The following series will show you how the same exact photo shot with every element the same except the ISO will look. The first is an ISO speed of 100. This is what it looks like with an ISO speed of 200. This is at a speed of 400 ISO. For those of you who used to shoot with non-digital cameras, this is what you often bought for sports photography. This is at a speed of 800 ISO. As you notice, the speed is allowing for more light to come in a shorter amount of time. For this camera, this is the fastest ISO speed of 1600. This allows for the most light to come in and works really well in low light situations. But why then wouldn't you want to shoot 1600 ISO always? Well, the problem is the image quality will be less with more graininess the faster the ISO. Given better light, 100 ISO is much better quality than 1600, so there's a trade-off. So here's the same subject shot from a distance holding the camera in your hands. The ISO speed is 100. Notice how blurry it is. Here's the exact same shot taken at 400 ISO and handheld, still somewhat blurry. Finally, here it is again, still handheld with an ISO of 1600. In this situation, even though you may have some loss of quality, using a high ISO is the best. But here's the same shot taken at a speed of 100 ISO, but placing your camera on a tripod. Now the image is both crisp and has less graininess. So basically, oftentimes if you are going to need to handhold, use a higher ISO if the lighting is poor, and a lower ISO if you have a tripod. The next setting to discuss will be aperture setting, or what is commonly called f-stops. An aperture is an opening, and the f-stop determines how wide or narrow that opening is. A low f-stop will create a wide opening, which will let in a lot of light, and a large f-stop will create a narrow aperture, letting in less light. This next series will demonstrate f-stops in low light on a tripod with all other settings constant, and will range from an f-stop of 4.5 to 29. Remember, the aperture is narrowing as the f-stop increases. So, if a high f-stop doesn't allow for as much light to come in because of a narrow aperture, why use a high f-stop? Well, because high f-stops allow more light information to come in slowly, the images can be more vivid and show greater detail, as well as allow for a deep depth of field. Using a tripod to take a photo slower, wide-angle landscapes are much better with a high f-stop. But trying to handhold a photo with a high f-stop will be almost impossible, as you'll get a blurred shots because the camera processes the shot slowly. Candid portraits where the camera is handheld are best shot with very low f-stops. This makes for greater skin tones and gives clear images even when people are moving slightly. This chart shows very graphically how your camera lens works. Notice how wide open your aperture is at f1.4 and how narrow at f8. And the Canon Rebel we have can go all the way up to f32. So this shows aperture or f-stops, just as ISO film speed, can determine how much light comes into your camera. If you know how to balance the two, you can not only regulate for different lighting conditions, but also for what kind of quality your photos will have. Here's a chart that shows a rule of thumb about f-stops. Anything lower than 7.0 can usually be handheld with fairly good focus, as long as the shutter speed is fast. Anything above 7.0 should always be placed on a tripod to get enough light without blurring. So a third aspect you can control in your camera is how fast your camera actually takes the photo. The camera has an opening-closing mechanism called a shutter. It is like a little door that opens and closes and determines how long the light settings will come in. The quickness or slowness of this is called the shutter speed. Shutter speeds can go anywhere from 1/4000th of a second, very fast, to as long as 30 seconds, very slow. faster the shutter speed, the more fine details you will catch. The longer, the more blurring effect you may get, but also the more details that can come in. The following photo display will show how light comes in if you keep every other element the same and just change the shutter speed. At 1/4000th of a second, the shutter goes so fast without a lot of light there's not enough time to capture the available light in an inside room. At 1/250th of a second, we are beginning to capture light from the outside window. At 1/50th of a second, you can start to see the subject beginning to emerge. At a half a second, the exposure is almost perfect. At a 4-second exposure, there is too much light coming in. And at 25 seconds, the subject is almost entirely washed out by all the light coming in. Shutter speed can determine how much detail you can see. Here, at 1/100th of a second with good lighting settings, you can capture the athlete's movement and water droplets without blur. But sometimes you actually want to show blur to create a nice effect. Here the exposure is at 30 seconds with good light settings and placed on a tripod. The water has a nice blurred effect even though the surrounding area is nice and clear. Also, in taking cityscapes at night where you want to capture the light, you would use a very slow shutter speed to allow enough time for the camera to capture what light there is. This shot was taken also at 30 seconds. The last aspect of learning to control the light in your camera is to understand how to use your light meter. The light meter is the most immediate way to control light. It can judge very quickly what the correct lighting will be for the other settings you have chosen in that particular scene. The range will usually be from -2 to +2. Most shots will work best if you have the setting very close to 0. In closing, understanding how your camera processes light is one of the most important aspects in creating good photos. But to do this, you need to understand ISO or film speed, aperture or f-stops, shutter speed, and light metering. Once you have these mastered, you will be able to create great photos for many years to come.